Hi guys, today I'm here to talk to you about sustainable building and Earthship Biotecture. My goal is to inspire you to create buildings with sustainable practices in mind, as well as tell you the story, which is very inspiring, of Mike Reynolds, who created Earthship Biotecture and how he brought it into existence. I see a room full of budding designers, learning the ropes to become great, efficient designers. According to my audience analysis survey, you guys were interested in Earthship Biotecture, and it's relevant to us all because we're all on the path to making and tinkering, coming up with new ideas and concepts. So I'm going to start off by telling you what an Earthship is, and then I will go into a little bit of detail about Mike's inspiring story of how he brought them to be. There is no question that industry has started to acknowledge that we need to design things with the environment in mind. And with that, it's our job as designers to design things with the environment in mind. Earthships are passive houses that house everything that its occupants need to live there and to live a slightly modern life. The principles behind Earthships are that there's nothing that comes in or goes out, so plumbing, electrical, things like that. They utilize all the resources that they can. Mike Reynolds first asked himself, what's the international building block? And he found his answer in trash. It's everywhere, and it's found in every corner of the world. And it just so happens that some of the things that he uses in Earthship, such as tires and cans and bottles, make for a really great building material to store thermal mass. Primarily, he uses tires as well as cans and bottles, but the tires are packed with earth, and then they're stacked like bricks, and the sun's energy throughout the day will warm them, and then at night it radiates that energy into the home. The bottles can be decorative, or he also uses cans put together like bricks, and then he encases them in mud and cement for the structure of the wall. This is one of the beautiful examples of an Earthship and how it doesn't have to be so much of an eyesore compared to what we're used to seeing. One of the other principles of the Earthship is that it collects water and it uses water economically. Typically the roof or other structure will collect all the water that it can throughout the year. This one's in the desert. It rains about 8 inches a year there, and it's almost enough water to last you the whole way through. A lot of times people maybe will have to have a truck bring them some water once in a while. But the Earthship itself will purify the water, and then essentially it'll use it 4 times before it's considered black water. Once it's collected, it's filtered and is put into on-site storage tanks. The water use in the Earthship first will come out the faucet, and that'll come out clean enough to drink, and you'll shower with it. Once it goes down the drain, it will go down into the ground below the greenhouse, so it'll water the plants out there, which by the way also provide food. The roots from those plants will help purify the water a little bit, and then it'll collect in a well underneath the greenhouse. When the toilet's flushed, the water will fill up the back of the toilet, and then after it's flushed, then it will go into the on-site septic tank, which will overflow into a 20 by 40 biocontainment area that's lined with a barrier and filled with plants, so then the plants will clean the water and prevent it from contaminating the earth. The other main principle of the Earthship is thermal mass. So the indoor climate of an Earthship typically stays around 70 degrees day and night year round. The angle of the windows on the greenhouse will reflect some of the summer sun, but then in the winter it catches all the summer sun, which penetrate that and then warms up the walls. There is a cooling system, a passive cooling system in place, which is basically a tunnel with a tube that goes through a berm, and there's operable skylights that can be opened. So when those skylights are opened, it pulls the air through the tunnel, which is cool, and it cools the house. The greenhouse is another main principle of an Earthship. You can grow food in there. Sometimes there's even tilapia ponds for fish, but also it warms the house quite efficiently. A little side note, this one here was one that he created that it ended up being too much greenhouse, and there was some mistakes made, but that was one of the things that was great about what he was doing is that he broke some of those building codes and he learned a lot, but he also created a new way of architecture. In the process, making some really beautiful houses. They don't all have to be so hippie-like. This is quite modern. You can put some more modern components in there. But so we know that Earthships aren't for everybody, or probably even most people. But they do create a great source of inspiration to pull some design ideas from and incorporate it into our building. So I've told you about what Earthships are, and next I want to tell you a little bit about Mike's story and how he brought them into being. But first I was just a little bit curious if anybody here had ever heard of Earthships before and what you think of them after knowing a little bit.
Like now or previous?
Have you heard of them previous?
From your other
To
previous?
Me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of them. They're really cool. I've always had a bunch of questions about them though. Like the glass bottles always get me. So I get the concept of the glass bottles. Does he cork the end of the bottle then so it becomes a dead air space? Or
typically, from what I've seen, it's not so much. But I have wondered that too, because like, what happens if it breaks?
well, that and if it's not corked, then it's not dead air space. That air gets into the inside of the home. So that's where I'm curious. I'm also curious about the cleaning of the bottles. It seems like that would be water wasteful, if you will.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really cool concept and it's a really cool look. I mean, you look at that picture that's up there and the light shining through it. It's really cool. But
I know that in his documentary Garbage Warrior, he had said that the bottles and the cans that they use in there, really, their purpose isn't insulation so much as to not use as much concrete
sure.
and mud around it. But I've personally wondered that before too, and I'm not quite sure, because in most of the pictures that I've seen, they're not quite corked. Plus, if they were, it wouldn't let so much light show through. So that's a good question to go find out.
Well, then, I think maybe you gotta explain to these guys the concept of that tunnel and the air going through it. Why did he do the tunnel?
Well, they did the tunnel because the earth keeps an ambient temperature. So in the summertime, when it's hot outside, the earth is cooler. So the tunnel is really long, and when air flows through that tunnel, it cools all the air down. And when that air is pulled through your house, it cools the environment. Likewise, in the wintertime, not so much with the tunnel, but with like geothermal heating, it's kind of the same concept where it's the earth that's heating, typically water and geothermal, that will then heat your house a little bit because of the air transfer.
Yeah, basically when you get down, what is it, 5 foot, the earth is at like 55 degrees year round.
Typically they bury down to about 6 feet for these. Okay, so I do want to tell you guys a little bit about Mike before we wrap this up, because his story is super inspiring. He worked really hard to get these Earthships to be what they are today. He went to architecture school and he graduated back in like '69. And when he graduated, he realized that architecture is, in his words, he said modern architecture is pretty much trash. So because it doesn't really address, the houses aren't changing, and it doesn't really conform to the people who are living inside of them. So anyway, he aspired to create his own form of architecture, which is where he came up with the concept that's now dubbed Earthships. The first Earthship that he built was his own, and that was a few years after graduating. But he built several of these, and he was teaching people how to build them, and people were interested in them, and then he was purchasing them, and he really wasn't selling land. Like, he'd buy a bunch of land and everybody would put their name in a hat and pay a small amount, and then whatever name you got is what plot you got. So it had nothing to do with building codes. And he was stripped of his credentials eventually because he had a couple lawsuits of some people who, though he expressed their experimental nature, filed lawsuits for defects such as leaky roofs or inadequate climate control. So because of that, he lost his architectural license and was not able to build, as well as they shut down some of his Earthship communities. A few years later, he went back to the state legislature with his tail between his legs and said, "What can I do to start building again?" And they said, "Become a subdivision," which super expensive. And he didn't want to put all the extra money into things that they weren't really using, like drawings of the land and etc. So he went down the straight and narrow and he built a bunch of generic cookie cutter houses for a couple of years, flying low. And then finally he realized that the problem was in state legislature. So he drafted a new bill called Sustainable Testing Site Law, which would allow them space to do experimental building, because typically they'd have a dream one night and the next day they'd wake up and start working on it. Well, they lost their ability to experiment like that. They lost their freedom to fail. So he drafted that bill, he took it to the legislature. Eventually it died because of filibustering. They ran him out of time. There was a tsunami and an earthquake overseas that then he received a letter of them asking his assistance to help come rebuild. So he went and built them a bunch of Earthships. They collected water, addressed some of the issues that their government wasn't able to help them with. And the locals were super excited. He taught them how to build them. And then he came back once his work was done. Shortly later, there was Hurricane Katrina. And so after that, he was inspired to take his bill back and try to get it passed. Well, it died again. Then 1 month after Katrina, there was Hurricane Rita in the Gulf of Mexico, where he again went to go help rebuild. And then after that, in 2006, the Board of Architects learned of his work in the Andaman Islands, so they invited him to reapply for his license. And by March of 2007, his testing site law had passed, and they were able to do their experimental building. Now that's 10 years where he was working on this thing to try to get it passed. And through those 10 years, it was hard, but he finally did it. And to me, that's just really amazing because he had this dream that he made happen. So today I have attempted to tell you guys about, or I've attempted to inspire you guys to incorporate some sustainable building practices from these Earthship principles, as well as to inspire you to go down your own path and design and carve your own way. As designers, it's our duty to create the change that we wish to see in the world. We're in the perfect place to do that. And oh yeah, Garbage Warrior is a super great documentary if you're remotely interested in Earthships. It's a good one. I had a hard time finding it somewhere to stream for free, but I found it on globalelite.tv. So if you're interested, I'd go check that out. And here are my references for all the pictures, and thank you guys for listening to me today.